Hi, this is Larry. I'm the safety manager with Halverson Company. Today I wanted to have you look at this, or look and listen to this video that we recorded. This was done as a company-wide safety meeting where we discussed confined space entry. And I think it does a really good job of going over a lot of the things we want you to know about confined space entry. And I really appreciate this one too, because we had a lot of input from our president and CEO, Steve Halverson, who had some very good things to add to this training. I know it's a little bit long, but I hope you can stick with it. It's really good training, and it does go over the things that we really need to know, and we really want you to know this so that you can stay safe out there. Thanks.
Okay, we need to go over confined spaces. I was looking at the roster, and we do have a few people who haven't heard this before, so this is good that we're going over this. So we're going to talk about two different things here. We're going to talk about confined space, and then we're going to talk about permit required confined space, because that's the one that we really need to deal with, is the permit required confined spaces. As part of our confined space training, we're going to go over what is a confined space, the permit versus the non-permit confined space, hazards and symptoms associated with working in confined spaces, and the workers' roles. There's also a little bit on employers' requirements we might need to touch on. So first of all, let's talk about what is a confined space. Okay, so here's what a confined space is. It needs to be big enough so you can get your body in it. Okay. It needs to have a limited or restricted means for entry or exit. They call it egress, so it has a limited or restricted means to get into it. So that means it's not a regular door. That means it's something that it's kind of hard to get into. So like a manhole, that would be restricted means. If you're getting into your attic, oftentimes you go into an attic through a little attic door. And you have to get out a step ladder and go up the step ladder and then climb up through into your attic. That would be restricted means for entry. Okay, some of the bins that we go in have pretty big entries on them, so they do not have restricted entry. Okay, the other thing that makes a confined space is it's not designated for continuous human occupancy. That means, is it a place you go to live? Can you live or work in that place normally? Okay, so my office might be awfully cramped. Maybe I've got a little cramped office that I work in, and so I might think that it's a confined space. So you look at it and you say, well, is it large enough to get into? Yes. Does it have a restricted means for entry and exit? No, there's a regular doorway to walk through. Is it designed for continuous human occupancy? Yes, it's meant for you to be in there. So that's the three things that are going to make up a confined space. So now let's talk about this. Does anybody recognize where this is?
Yeah, Balchem.
This is Balchem, right? And you know what's going on there?
Yeah, they're replacing liners inside.
Right. And so there is actually a guy inside this there. You can see the bright light coming out of that entryway there, that little access door. So they're in there welding, right? So we had to go inside to repair it, with, like you said, to put some new lining on it. We're welding metal plates to the existing walls. So first of all, is that a confined space? Anybody have a thought? What do you think, Miguel? Is that a confined space?
Yeah.
Yep, definitely, yeah. Right? So let's just think about our things. Can you get into it? Is it big enough to get your body in there? Well, there he is.
Just barely.
You recognize who that is? That's Angel.
Oh.
So Angel's in there welding that. So yeah, it's big enough to get your body into it. At least for some of us. I might not be able to get into that. But shut up, Robert. Okay, is it got a restricted opening for entry? Yeah, that's not a regular doorway, right? That's not a regular opening. That's pretty restricted to get into. Anytime there's a little hatch like that, yes, it's restricted. Yes, it's a confined space. And then, are you meant to work in this type of an environment? Is it meant for people to be in there? No, it's not meant for people. It's meant for product. So because it meets all three of those, it's big enough to enter and work, it has a restricted opening, and it's not meant for continuous human occupancy, so that's a confined space. Okay. That kind of just really quickly tells you what is a confined space. How about this, what we've got on the screen right there? Is this hopper a confined space? So let's look at it. Is it big enough to get in? You can see the outline of the man on the left, and you can see, you know, kind of the shadow of him inside. So yeah, obviously you could get a person inside there. Does it have a restricted opening? You have to get in through that little manhole. That's pretty restricted. Is that meant for people to be in? Or is that meant for product?
Product.
Yep, just product, right? So it's big enough to get in, has a restricted opening, and it is not meant for people. So, yep, that's a confined space. Let's do one more really quick. Okay, this is one I use a lot just because it kind of, I think it helps drive home what a confined space is. Okay, this is a crawl space underneath a house. You can get into it, obviously, it's big enough to enter and work. You do have to come in through, it's not a regular door that you're coming in through, it's a restricted opening. And it's not meant for where you're supposed to live. That's where you're supposed to have your pipes and things. You're not supposed to be people in there very often. So that your crawl space under your home is probably a confined space. Big enough to enter and work, yes. Restricted opening, kind of, because it's, you know, all choked up with boxes. Meant for human occupancy, it is actually meant for people, so it doesn't meet that criteria. Okay, I'm not going to go. I'm going to kind of slip through this really quick. This one, not a confined space because of the door. It's easy to get in. It's got easy entrance, easy exit, right? Okay, so now that we know what a confined space is, let's talk really quick about a permit required confined space. So let's talk about your crawl space underneath your house or your attic in your house. It may be a confined space, but even though it's a confined space, there's probably not a lot of inherent hazards with it. If there are hazards that OSHA has identified, and we'll go over those in a second, then at that point, we need to make sure that we get a permit before we go in there. So to go into my attic, I'm probably going to be just fine. I don't need a permit to go into my attic. But to go into a hopper on the job site, I'm going to need a permit for that. That's a permit. That's the difference between a confined space and a permit required confined space. So let's talk about that. Different areas that might be confined space that needs a permit. So things like tunnels, shallow excavations, crawl spaces, attics, those typically do not need a permit. The ones that typically will need a permit are things like bins, boilers, tanks. So if it is going to need a permit, it's going to meet this criteria here. Any one of these things are going to say, yeah, let's make sure we have a permit for this. So if it can have the potential for a hazardous atmosphere, if it has the potential to engulf. Okay, Robert, what is the potential to engulf? What does that mean?
Like a full grain bin.
Yeah,
You step into a full grain bin on top and you sink into it. Or if you're inside something and it has potential for some product to fall on top of you.
perfect. Here's another one. Inward converging walls are floors that slope downward. A lot of times we have to go into bins or hoppers and do repair where the floor slopes downward. Automatically, that is a confined space that needs a permit. And then the last one would be any other serious safety hazard. So let's talk about a hazardous atmosphere. There's a lot of things that we could classify as a hazardous atmosphere, but what we're talking about here is inside a confined space where this hazardous atmosphere is there, and that's the air that we have to breathe. So I like this photo that I've got here because it just kind of shows that, you know, sometimes we don't think about ventilation as well as we could. Now, if you're inside a confined space, you might not have the ability to do that as easily. The one on the left there talks about oxygen. What do you think we're gonna, what's important about oxygen? I mean, obviously that's what we breathe, but how does a confined space affected by oxygen? Kind of an awkward question, huh? It's the lack of oxygen, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Is if you're doing something in that confined space, maybe there's something else in there that's pushing the oxygen out. This is kind of one of the big killers that happens with confined spaces. People end up getting asphyxiated because there's not enough oxygen for them. And typically it's because there's something else is inside that confined space that has pushed the oxygen out of there. So there's not enough oxygen to breathe when you get in there. Potential to engulf, Robert went over that. Inward converging walls or floor that slopes downward. This is simple, guys. If it looks like that, that's a permit required confined space. And then other serious safety or health hazards. People ask me what that could be. It could be something like this. How would you like to be crawling around in that? That to me is a pretty serious health hazard. Could be things like mechanical, electrical, congested, heat stress. Here's an example of heat stress. Look at that stuff coming out of there. I don't want to go down in that confined space. So that one definitely is permit required. I don't like that barricade around that very much either. Okay, so if it's permit required, again, it has to have a hazardous atmosphere or potential for one, potential to engulf. If it has those sloped floors or there's another serious safety hazard, any of those are going to make it permit required. So that being said, on our job sites, you're going to run across a lot of permit required confined space. First thing you're going to do is you're going to do a get that permit. Okay, let's go over a couple of this. I think I've only got a couple of these. So we talked about some confined spaces. Let's go over this one a little bit. So this is Angel inside that piece of machinery, fixing it. Let's determine if this is permit required. Does it have a hazardous atmosphere? It actually did not have a hazardous atmosphere. It was okay. But it did have the potential for hazardous atmosphere. And why? What is he doing in there?
Welding.
Welding. Okay. Can welding affect your atmosphere in a confined space?
Yeah.
Yeah, welding. How about things like spray painting?
Yes.
Maybe even silicone. You know, if you're doing a lot of silicone inside a confined space, that can start to get kind of strong too, right? So what do you do in that situation? Just while we're talking about it.
We use mask,
You can use a mask, respirator. Then remember, that's a PPE, and that's definitely an option. Remember, that's always our last option.
Try to get a fan in there.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get some ventilation. Perfect. Thank you. That's what we did on this one. There's actually two openings on this piece of machinery. There's one similar to this opening on the other side. And so we put a box fan on that other side, and there was always air continuously blowing through there for Angel in there. Okay. Was there a potential to engulf? There wasn't. I mean, you know, there was no material that enter in where it could come in from the top, and besides, everything was locked out. It did not have inward converging walls or a floor that slopes downward. What he was sitting on was pretty good. And there was not necessarily another serious safety hazard. But because of that hazardous atmosphere or that potential for hazardous atmosphere, we still call this a permit required confined space. Okay, I just wanted to talk about this one really quick. Again, guy in the crawl space. Hazardous atmosphere, there is not a hazardous atmosphere. It was pretty wide open. You know, there's probably not much potential for a hazardous atmosphere. Is there grain going to fall on him while he's in there or dirt that could fall around him? There's probably not, so no potential to engulf. You can see that there's no inward converging walls. There's no floor that slopes downward. Doesn't have that funnel shape to it. And there's really no other serious safety hazard. So,
Spiders and snakes.
Yeah, there might be spiders and snakes in there, right? Oh man, I had a spider in my bedroom the other day that I swear it was 2 inches big. I was scared to step on it for the mess that it would make. Okay, so this confined space is probably not a permit required confined space because it doesn't have any of these potential hazards. So we wouldn't have to pull a permit to go in there. You know, it's good to be aware of what the hazards might be. Like Robert said, you might have some snakes or something in there, so it'd be good to be aware of that. Definitely could bump your head. It'd be good to have a bump cap or something, but it's not required that you fill out a permit. Okay, how about that one? Look at the shape of it. Remember what I said, anytime you have that cone shape to the bottom of a bin that you have to go into, that's permit required. So even though there's probably other reasons why this is permit required, just seeing it and knowing that it's got that shape to it, automatically it's permit required. So hazardous atmosphere potential, yeah, it could be. Let's say it doesn't in this case. Potential to engulf, it could, but in this case, let's say it doesn't. But it does have that, definitely has that converging walls. So because of that, this would be a permit required, regardless of anything else. So this is a Halverson policy that I wanted to talk about, is if we are doing a confined space entry, our Halverson policy is that we need 3 Halverson employees. And we want them to be Halverson employees when we do the confined space entry. Why don't we use one of the employees from the facility and 2 of our guys? Why do we try to have 3 of our own guys? Training, right? Yeah, thank you, Frank. That's perfect. That's exactly right. So for one thing, we're trained in construction. A lot of the facilities we go to, they're not trained in construction. There are a few different rules for construction than for general industry. And the other one is we don't know what trainings they've had. Do you know if the guy that you know that from the facility, is he trained to be an entrant? Is he trained to be, what roles can he do? And what kind of training did he have? Do you feel comfortable with that? So because of that, we just try to, whenever possible, have 3 Halverson employees when we're doing a confined space entry. Now, that means, again, for estimators, you need to be aware of that you're going to have to send 3 guys to a job that might only need 2. Well, if you're doing confined space entry, we need to send 1 more. Okay, that also means for foremen, supervisors, make sure you're thinking ahead and looking ahead so that you've got that, what day that you're planning on doing this and that you have sufficient crew there to take care of it. Okay, fill out your permits. Your permits need to have certain things on them. They need to have the date. We try to determine what the duration is of our entry, the reason we're going in, where we're going in, what the hazards are that are going to be there. We want to identify the roles and duties. What that means is who's going to be the attendant, who's going to be the whole watch. The attendant sometimes is called the whole watch. Who's going to be the entrance, the people going in and doing the work, and who's going to be the supervisor. So we need to have that all written down on the permit. And this is important to know. If let's say that Tristan is an attendant on a job and he needs to go take off and go do something, can he just go to Dan Lee and say, hey, Dan Lee, take over as attendant for me? Now, if Dan Lee's name is on the permit also as an attendant, then he might do that, right? As long as they're both authorized attendants, then they can take over. They can swap for each other. But if their names aren't both on there, then they can't. So that's what an authorized attendant means, is that your name is on the form as one of the people who is an attendant. Okay, so let's talk about that roles and duties. So we got a job where we're going to list on the permit attendants Frank, Larry, and Rayford. We're going to list the entrance as Frank and Larry, and we're going to list the supervisor as Rayford. Now, we only need 1 person in the hole at a time. So do we need 2 entrants? Do both Frank and Larry, are they both going to be entrants? Or are they both going to be attendants? Or how does this work? How come I've got them all listed there? How can I have Frank, Larry, and Rayford be an attendant and Frank and Larry also be an entrant?
That will allow them to switch positions.
Exactly. So this is why you list them all on there, so that they are all now authorized to do that role. They're authorized to perform that duty. Okay, if they're not on the permit to do that, then they can't do it. So even though Rayford is the supervisor, if I don't list him as an attendant, even though he's the supervisor, he can't take over as an attendant. So keep that in mind as you're filling out your permits. Yes, Robert.
What if you need more than 1 entrant?
Okay, so what if we need more than 1 entrant? Then what? What do you mean?
That's what I'm asking. What if we need more than 1 entrant? Do we need to have multiple attendants?
Good question. Anybody else have an answer for that? Okay, so both Frank and Larry are going to be inside the hole. Are we okay with just Rayford being the attendant? Or do we have to have two attendants if we have two entrants?
Good question.
Good.
One attendant is usually going to be fine. One attendant on duty at a time. No matter how many entrants you have in there.
Already?
Yeah.
Oh.
Now, it would be something that we would review at some time, depending on what the confined space is. We might look at it and say, well, wait a minute, we're going to need one more person. For instance, if we're dropping a person vertically down in a hole, is one entrant going to be able to get that person up out of there? Or is one attendant, I'm sorry, going to be able to get that entrant up out of there by himself? Supposed to be if they got the correct mechanical means to retrieve them. But that would be something we'd want to talk about. But typically, yeah, one attendant is fine per hole.
Do they need lifelines as well?
Do we need lifelines? We always try to figure out a way to get the attendant out of the hole, out of the confined space, without having to go in after him. We want to do what's called a non-entry rescue. So anytime we're putting somebody into a confined space, we want to give some thought to how are we going to get that person out of the confined space if there's a problem. And we always want to do that without having to go in and retrieve them. Why is that? Why don't we want to just go in and grab them and get them out?
Because you don't want to go into the same atmosphere and have the same condition.
Yeah, maybe there was a problem with the atmosphere. Maybe there's something else why they got sick or they succumbed because there was not enough oxygen. So now if we go inside there, instead of rescuing them, we might just be stacking bodies. And that's what we want to try to avoid. So yeah, lifelines are a good thing. Figure out a way. How are you going to get this guy out of there if you have to? Always good to have that plan in place or plan ahead of time. Okay, on the permit, speaking of atmospheres, we're going to write down the atmosphere, what it is. We're going to make sure we check it before we go in there. We want to make sure that we're looking for at least 19% oxygen, 19.5% oxygen. That's the main one, is the low end there. This is where OSHA, it's right from the regulations, state what your oxygen level has to be, between 19.5 and 23.5. Where the biggest problem comes in, though, is if you get below that 19.5. Start getting some symptoms that we might go over here in a second. Okay, we also want to look for flammable gases. So we're going to check the oxygen. We're going to check for flammable gases in the area. We're going to check for carbon monoxide in the area. That's the silent killer. We don't know about carbon monoxide. We don't smell it. We don't see it. If it's in the area and if it's in greater than 25 parts per million concentrations, that can be deadly for us. So we need to check that. And we might be checking for other toxic gases, depending on what the facility says has been stored in that particular confined space. So how are we going to do that? Yeah, get that monitor, right? We're going to take a monitor, gas detector, an air checker. We're going to check for oxygen content. We're going to check for flammability, explosion potential. We'll check for that carbon monoxide. And one of the most dangerous gases that we'll check for is hydrogen sulfide.
Hey, Larry, real quick. One of the things you brought up was dust, and I think it's an interesting thing to talk about because my understanding is the poor gas testers aren't going to test for dust. But if we're in a bin and we need ventilation in order to blow in air in there, we don't want to create a situation where we're creating a dust cloud within a confined space, because that could create an explosion hazard. So especially if we're welding or cutting or doing something like that, which is highly likely that would be the case. So, any additional thoughts or counsel related to dust?
Yeah, that's a great point. That is one of the ones that it is on my slide there, and I kind of just skipped over it quick, but it's one of the ones we should discuss a little bit better because, like Steve said, our gas detector, our atmosphere checker is not going to test for dust. So what's kind of the rule of thumb? Does anybody know what the rule of thumb is for dust? How much dust is too much dust? What's that?
You don't see them.
Yeah, it's basically it's a visual check, right? So you guys need to have a pretty good, feel. I think working in this industry, you guys have a pretty good feel for when things are getting pretty dusty. Robert took me over to Stanley Hay first time that I went over there, and it was pretty dusty inside. It gets pretty dusty sometimes. They open up and get some ventilation going through there, but it's just going to be a dusty environment. Now, how much dust is too much? OSHA does have an old document that says if you can't see a 25-watt light bulb from 5 feet away. Now that's a pretty dim light bulb, and that's pretty close to it from 5 feet away. So it's got to get pretty dusty, but that can happen really quick, and that's what Steve just brought up. Whatever we're doing, whatever activity we're doing in a confined space might create a bunch of dust, and so that's something our in mind as we're thinking about the hazards that we have there. We're going to be starting a job here this week at Simplot, and they had an explosion at Simplot. Who's familiar with that project? Can somebody just quickly say how that explosion happened? Who's online that knows about that one? Anthony, do you know about what happened there?
Yeah, basically they turned on the aeration in the receiving tunnel and it kicked up dust.
The receiving tunnel, what were they doing?
Welding.
So they were doing a welding operation, and while they were in this tunnel, they started up, they had a lot of stuff. I guess they had a lot of it locked out, right? So the conveyor there was locked out, but one thing they didn't think about locking out was the dust control system that they had. And so when that got turned on, when that aeration system got turned on, apparently it kicked up a bunch of dust. And so what may have been a safe environment for them to be doing hot work in, now that all that dust got kicked up, it was no longer safe. And it created the fire, the explosion that we're having to go in and help fix now.
And then working by himself.
And the individual was working by himself. Did he sustain injuries?
Yeah.
Do you know, Robert?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. The other thing just to note with any type of air system like that, a dust collection system, it's sucking air in. And so a lot of times if you're welding, it can suck in our sparks or other things like that and create that environment where an explosion can happen. And sometimes what happens is you actually have multiple explosions. You have the first smaller explosion that kind of rattles everything else, and then the rest of the dust in the area that's sitting on equipment and everything else gets shook enough that then it creates a secondary explosion that really levels things. So we got to be really careful, especially if there is dust collection systems, that we're making sure that that's on our list of things that we lock out or in some way prevent any type of spark getting into a dust collector or bag house.
I'm glad you brought it up, Steve, because that's something that we don't think about often. In fact, David and I were having this conversation again. We've talked about it a couple times, but just the other day we were talking about it again. That, what else do we not think about that might be, a potential hazard there if it's not locked out, or if we don't somehow control it, like Steve's saying here. So it's tough. Sometimes it's hard to know about these things. In hindsight, you look at it and you go, oh yeah, well, that should have definitely been locked out. But it seems like they tried to do everything beforehand that they were supposed to do, and they just forgot about this thing. So great conversation, guys, and great things to be thinking about when you're talking about your hazards. Okay, so test the air prior to entry. Let's test it before 20 minutes before we go in. Test it in several locations. If you just test it up close, like this guy's going to do a vertical entry. If he just tests the air up at the top, he might not know that the air down lower is bad. So test it in several locations, and then before you go in, you're going to test it again. So we want to test it, and then we want to check it again. Why do you think we want to check it? Yeah, 20 minutes. That's good. That's a good time. 20 minutes, half hour. We do it apart. But why do we do that? Why do we check it twice?
Conditions could change.
Yeah, we want to see if something's happening. Maybe the oxygen's going down. Maybe it's getting less, and then we want to know why, right?
Double check. Double check.
Double check it. Very good. Okay, something that is required for us in the construction industry is you have to have that monitor on you 100% of the time when you're inside the confined space. So it used to be that we could just check it every few minutes. Now you actually have to have it on you so that it will alarm. They have an alarm on them. That alarm could go off while you're in there. And so it's good to have it with you the whole time that you're in there. We do not own our own atmosphere monitors. Keep that in mind. You need to set up
Larry, I got a question for you.
Yes.
Hey, if we're inside of a bin, flat bottom grain bin, and you have the manhole, which makes it a permit required, what if you have a couple of sheets off the side of it removed? Is that permit required or not permit required?
In most cases, we've been able to reclassify those as non-permit required while the sheets have been removed.
Is there a size of hole that makes it non-permit?
Not necessarily, no. It just what we're looking for there more than probably the size of entry. I mean, we want to have an easy way to get in and out. So if I'm having to crawl through a hole to get in and out, it takes some time to get in and out of there. If you've got it big enough that I can just kind of get in and out easily, maybe bend over and walk in or walk out, that's not too big a deal. If I have to get on a ladder, climb up to an opening to get in, and then the same thing to get out, then that's kind of a hazard right there. But if I can get in and out fairly easy, that's what we'd be looking for there. But more than that, what I like about it is when you're opening up a larger opening like that, you're allowing for more air movement. So what it does for the confined space portion of it is it helps to create it so that there's not the potential for a dangerous environment, a dangerous atmosphere. So if you can open it up big enough that we know that you've got a lot of good ventilation now, that's the more important thing for me. Good question. Thank you. If we can't get a good enough ventilation in just through the doors or through the openings that we created, add some ventilation. Here's some good ways to do that. Okay, I'm going to go over roles of entry really quick. We talked about the three things, the person standing outside at the hole watch, the person who's inside, and then the person who's doing the permits. So we got the entrant, the attendant, and the supervisor. The entrant is the person inside. He must be aware and be able to identify the hazards. So let me ask you this. Everybody involved in this needs to know what the hazards are. That's going to be a part of every role. How do we do that? How do we know that everybody knows what the hazards are? Yeah, you talk about it. Exactly. Thank you. So have yourselves a little meeting before you're doing your confined space. Get together and say, okay, here's the confined space. Here's the potential hazards. And go over them together and come up with your plan together. Make sure everybody knows the hazards and the plan. Okay, the entrant has to be able to communicate with the attendant. And he has to do that quite often. So if Frank's inside the hole and I'm the attendant, he's going to get tired of me asking, but every few minutes I'm going to say, how's it going, Frank? He's going to say, leave me alone. And then a few minutes later, I'm going to say, Frank, and he's going to say, what? I'm going to say, what's going on in there, Frank? He's going to say, I'm just working, leave me alone. But why is that important that I keep that communication going?
Checking up on them.
Checking up on him, right? Now, if Frank isn't responding to me, or what if Frank's in the hole and I say, how's it going, Frank? And he just kind of mumbles something.
Something's wrong.
It could be wrong, right? There could be a problem. So that's why that communication is important. And that's what the entrant and the attendant need to have going on. Okay, wear appropriate PPE and make sure you know how to get out of the space. Attendant's the guy who's outside. He cannot, oh, this is important. The attendant can't leave to get tools. What happens if Frank is down in the hole. Tristan is outside as the attendant, but Tristan needs to go to the bathroom. Can he go to the bathroom?
No.
Okay. If it's an emergency and he has to go to the bathroom, what has to happen?
He has to pee in the bottle.
That's
funny, but it's true.
Yeah, he has a bottle, he can stay right there by the hole. That's one option. Okay.
Frank
Yeah.
needs to come out, or there needs to be another attendant that can take his spot.
Exactly. So here's what we have to do is if there's only one attendant on the list, if you've only put one attendant on your permit and that attendant has to leave for some reason, that means that you have to suspend the entry. Okay. Frank has to come out of the hole. And then you get taken care of whatever you need to. Because we're in construction, we can do that. We can suspend an entry and we can go back into it. We have to write that down, that we suspended it at this time and we reinitiated it at a certain time. Okay, but that's why it's a good idea, if you can, to have two attendants listed on your permit so that the other attendant can take over for him. Okay, the attendant's going to monitor anybody who's in there, making sure they're okay, keeping that communication going. He's going to try, if he recognizes there's any problems, he says get out. Now, if I'm in the hole and Tristan's outside the hole and he says, Larry, it's an emergency, get out of there now. I don't go, well, what's the emergency? Why do I have to get out? I'm right in the middle of this. I have to do what the attendant says. Tristan says, get out. I have to drop everything, make sure it's safe and get out. And the attendant is the guy who's going to initiate the procedure to summon help if we need it. Supervisors, they need to also know the hazards of the confined space. The construction standard says that the supervisor has to personally inspect the space. So this means that I can't sit over in the trailer and never go and look at the confined space and say, okay, guys, go over and go to this confined space. I understand it's over here in this area. And I heard that here's the hazards you need to be aware of. Okay, I can't do that. I would need to go over and look at it, see the hazards myself. The supervisor also has to be on site at the construction during the entry. So he doesn't have to be there at the hole. He doesn't have to be an attendant. He doesn't have to be an entrant, but he has to be on site. That's by OSHA. He's going to ensure the plan, including a rescue plan, has been communicated to all workers, verify that the permit's been filled out correctly, and then this last one is important. He's going to review that with the office. That is a Halverson policy that we review with the office before we go into the confined space. So we get it all ready to go. We've had our little meeting. Everybody's aware of what the hazards are. Everybody's aware of the plan. Before we do our final entry, or before we make that entry though, let's call up Rick or call up Larry Hatch and do a little review. Let's just make sure that we've thought about everything we need to. That puts one more pair of eyes, as it were, on this situation. It also lets us all know who's doing what and in what positions there are. So we can go over it and say, okay, we done this, have we done this, have we done this? And then also so that we know who's in a dangerous situation and how to get them out of there. Okay, supervisors can authorize the permit, terminate the permit, submit them for records. Just so that you're aware, as the employer, we have to maintain these records, keep them on file, review them. Supervisor can suspend the permit and reinstate it. Evacuate the space. I was going to talk about this really quick. If oxygen levels are low, what the symptoms you're looking for there with the guys: shortness of breath, confusion, lips turn blue, maybe your fingernails also could turn blue, and you're seeing spots. Obviously, fainting is going to be the worst one of those potential symptoms, that we don't want to ever get to that. Okay, I mentioned that if you're going into a vertical entry that you may have to have some help getting the guy out. This is the help you have to have: a tripod. Okay, this is a mechanical means. OSHA requires that anytime you let a person go into a permit required confined space where they're having to be lowered into it more than 5 feet deep, Okay, so again, this is going down from the top and it's more than 5 feet deep. You must have a tripod. You must have a mechanical means to pull that guy out. So here we've got one entrant, we've got one attendant. That one attendant can get that guy out of the hole because he's got the right means to do so, because he's got that tripod. Okay, the supervisor. I just wanted to point this one out here is because, you know, all the photos that I've taken of this area, it doesn't really show the supervisor. Mike Isaacson was the supervisor on this job. He was actually around the corner doing some work on something else. The supervisor's not the attendant. He does not have to be in the immediate area, but he does have to be on site. Okay, just pointing out also on this job, they had they had a supervisor, they had an entrant attendant, they had a permit right there. They posted that it was a confined space. So this was a good confined space. These guys did a good job on this one. Okay, employers have to have a written program. We have to evaluate it. Training is required before entry and periodic training. This is why we go over this every year, guys. I know sometimes it gets old, but it's important that we do it. And we had some good discussions today, so I appreciate that from everyone. We need to go, we keep our permits for a year, our training records, as long as the employee's with the company. We evaluate the program from time to time. A few other rules. 1926 states that if we're on a job site where they have never determined where their confined spaces are, their permit required confined spaces are, we have to provide a competent person from our crew to go through and determine if there's any permit required confined spaces we need to be aware of. The construction standard requires that the facilities we go to identify the confined spaces, that they have a written program, that they share with us where their confined space, permit required confined spaces are, and what the hazards that they know of are associated with them. Yeah, Robert.
So Larry, on that note, highly recommended we notify the local fire department for, and let them know that we are doing a confined space. So that so if there is an issue or emergency, they will be aware of it.
Yeah, definitely. So we talked a little bit about how, you know, if something happens, we don't want to have to go in after anybody to get them out. We want to try to be able to get them out by doing non-entry methods. So maybe we have a lifeline attached to them that we can pull them out. Maybe we use the bosun chair and dropped them down from the top in, and we can get them out with that bosun chair. But if something happens where we can't get them out, remember it's really dangerous. Maybe the atmosphere was bad and we don't want to go in after them. We have the fire department go in and get them using their scuba equipment, right? They're trained for it. They have scuba gear so that they can go in and get into situations like that without killing themselves in the process. So, like Robert's saying, that needs to be part of your emergency plan. How are we getting these guys out of here? Well, our non-entry technique is we're going to pull them out. We're going to tie a rope to the guys. We're going to tie a rope around the guy's neck and pull him out. No, don't tie it around his neck. Tie it to his harness, right? Have him wear his harness. Tie a rope to him and pull him out that way if you can. If you can't, and there's no problem at all, guys, calling the fire department and letting them know, hey, Thursday next week in the afternoon on Thursday, we're going to have a confined space entry here at this facility in such and such city.
Larry,
Yes.
so sometimes we were in the middle of nowhere too.
Yeah, and sometimes we are in the middle of nowhere. So we need to come up with a plan. So that's one of those things that we need to be aware of up front and have that plan ready to go, right? Like Rick's always saying, guys, have a plan and then work your plan. Okay, we've gone over today what's a confined space, permit versus non-permit, the hazards and symptoms associated with some of the hazards in there. Workers, the different roles of the workers and some of the employer's requirements. Are there any questions about confined spaces or any other comments?
Hey, Larry, just one comment, and we just barely talked about it, and I appreciate Robert emphasizing this on the rescue stuff and getting with fire departments and and facilities. I mean, this should be a team effort. We should be coordinating it with facilities as much as possible as well. And they may have their own rescue procedures that we should try and tap into and just make sure that we're aware of everything and they're aware of everything. Because, you know, as Larry's talking about, this is one of those topics that this could be life or death for someone. So we need to take it very seriously. And you know, one of the things that Rick's like to say, since we're quoting Rick a lot here, is he likes to think of what's the worst thing that could happen. You know, if someone faints or passes out inside a confined space, that's not the time to be thinking through how we get them out. We have to have a reliable way to get them out, and we need to know how to do it. And so, if someone does get out, we still may need those emergency responders to help with first aid or any type of CPR or anything that may have happened. So just be aware that the time to do that is before. That's really one of the main reasons why we want you to call and talk to Larry and review it with Larry or review it with Rick, or if they're not available, review it with me, is to make sure we've really thought through the worst case scenario side of things so that we're prepared if someone goes down. It's not acceptable to roll the dice with anybody's life. So we have to make sure that that's ready to roll.